When we finally slowed, gasping for air, Max turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I had no answer. All I knew was that we had made it out barely. But whatever was waiting in that basement, it wasn't done with us. Not yet. And somehow, I knew we had just escaped by the slimmest margin. We didn't speak much after that night. No one wanted to bring it up, as if saying it out loud would make it real again. Ali, Max, and I tried to move on, but the memory stuck with us like a scar that refused to fade. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark silhouette standing at the end of the hall, watching, waiting. I kept telling myself it was over, that we had escaped. But something about the way the church felt that night gnawed at me. It was as if the place had been waiting for us all along, drawing us in like prey into a trap. And though we had gotten away, it felt like a part of us had stayed behind, left in the shadows of that basement. We never went back, not together, at least. In the weeks that followed, I found myself lying awake at night, replaying every moment in my mind. I thought about the strange photo on the dresser, the fresh red stains, and the heavy silence that seemed to breathe down our necks. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. Years later, curiosity got the better of me. I drove back to the spot where the church used to stand, hoping to find some kind of closure. But when I got there, the building was gone. In its place was an empty lot, flattened and fenced off, as if the place had been erased from existence. I scoured the internet, searching for any mention of the old church, its history, rumors, anything that could explain what we had experienced. But I found nothing. No records, no urban legends, not even a mention of the address. It was as if the church had never existed at all. I kept the photo Sebastian had snapped of that night, though I rarely looked at it. When I did, it brought back the same eerie feeling, like I was still being watched. I'd hoped time would make the memory easier to bear, but it didn't. If anything, the mystery grew heavier with every passing year. Sometimes I wonder what really happened that night. Did we stumble into something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world? Or was it all in our heads, a trick of fear and imagination? I doubt I'll ever know. What I do know is this: I am grateful we weren't alone that night. If I had been by myself, I might not have made it out. And even now, after all these years, part of me is still waiting for the answer. Or maybe, just maybe, I'm waiting for the shadows to find me again. Even now, I can't escape the feeling that we left something behind that night, or maybe it followed us. There are moments, usually late at night, when I catch myself listening for sounds that don't belong. A faint shuffle in the hallway, the creak of a door. It's subtle, but it's enough to set my heart racing, pulling me back to that basement in an instant. Ali moved out of town not long after, and Max stopped talking about what happened altogether. I don't blame them. Some things are easier to forget when you bury them deep. But I never found that peace. The memory stays with me, buried just beneath the surface, waiting to rise when the nights grow too quiet. Sometimes, I wonder if we were meant to leave that night, if we were supposed to walk out of that place at all. It didn't feel like we escaped by chance. It felt like something let us go, like it had decided we weren't ready to understand what we had stumbled into. And that thought is almost worse than the fear itself. The fact that the church no longer exists only makes it harder to shake. If I had just one trace, one piece of evidence, maybe I could convince myself it was all real, or maybe I could finally believe it wasn't. But there's nothing. No building, no history, no sign it was ever there. Just a lingering shadow in the back of my mind, always waiting to resurface. I've learned to live with the questions, though they never stop gnawing at me. Sometimes, when I look out my window late at night, I find myself expecting to see someone standing just beyond the edge of the light, waiting, like that shadow in the basement, patient and still. There are things in this world we aren't meant to understand. I believe that now more than ever. What we found that night in the church was one of those things, something ancient, quiet, and dangerous. And though it let us leave, I know that we'll never really be free of it. Not entirely. The worst part. I know I'll never go back to that place. But sometimes I wonder if it will find its way back to me. And if it does, I don't think I'll be able to run fast enough this time. The first sign that things weren't quite right happened not long after we left the church. At first, it seemed small, so small I thought I was imagining it. It started with little things I couldn't explain. My bedroom door would be open when I knew I'd closed it. A light I had turned off would be glowing softly when I came back into the room. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to forgetfulness. But deep down, it unsettled me. Max and Ali mentioned similar things in passing. Ali told me her keys kept going missing, only to turn up exactly where she'd already looked. Max joked about hearing strange knocks at his front door late at night, but when he went to check, no one was there. We laughed it off at the time, pretending it was nothing, just our nerves playing tricks on us. But none of us could shake the feeling that something had followed us home from that church. The real turning point came late one night when I was in bed, drifting in and out of sleep. That's when I heard its soft footsteps on the floorboards, slow and deliberate, as if someone was carefully walking through my hallway. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. I held my breath, listening, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, thick and suffocating. I stared at the ceiling, frozen, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stay still. Then, the door handle rattled softly, as if someone on the other side was testing it. I sat up quickly, my heart hammering, and flicked on the bedside lamp. The room filled with dim yellow light, and everything went quiet. I stared at the door, expecting it to swing open, but nothing happened. The handle sat perfectly still, untouched. I told myself it was a dream, just a lingering fear from that night at the church. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps, the movement, the sense that something was standing right outside that door, it was all too real. And for the first time since that night, I realized that whatever we had encountered in that church wasn't finished with us. It had only just begun. Even after that night, the weight of his emotional manipulation lingered. I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next call, the next crisis. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach twisted in knots. It was like I was still tethered to him, even though we were supposed to be done. I realized that leaving him wouldn't be as simple as walking away. He wasn't going to let me go, not without pulling me down with him first. After the breakup, I tried to move forward, telling myself that things would get better with time. I distanced myself from him, hoping that the space would help me heal. I focused on rebuilding my life, finding comfort in small routines, reconnecting with old friends, and trying to build something that resembled stability. But it didn't take long for the cracks to appear. Every step forward felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath me could give way at any moment. I thought I could handle being alone, but loneliness is a dangerous thing. The silence grew louder with each passing day, and eventually, it became unbearable. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe I had made a mistake by walking away from him. I told myself it wasn't about love, it was just about needing someone, anyone, to fill the emptiness. Against my better judgment, I reached out to him again. I thought we could keep things simple this time, just as friends. I was wrong. At first, it felt like relief. He seemed calmer, more grounded. He told me he'd been working on himself, trying to get better. For a moment, I let myself believe it. But it didn't take long before the familiar patterns started to creep back in. The subtle digs, the way he would dismiss my feelings while making everything about himself, it was all still there, just dressed up differently. And then came the moments when his behavior spiraled into something worse than before. He wasn't just manipulative anymore, he was openly cruel. The insults became sharper, the emotional swings more violent. If he was sober, he'd act distant, as if I were nothing more than an inconvenience. But when he wasn't sober, his words cut deep. He twisted every conversation, making me feel like I was the problem. It was as if the breakup had given him permission to drop all pretenses, and I realized that whatever kindness I had seen in him before had been nothing more than a mask. It was a mistake to let him back into my life, but by the time I saw it, it felt too late. Every attempt to pull away only made things worse. The toxicity was like a fog that clouded my mind, making it hard to think clearly. I kept telling myself I could fix this, that if I stayed calm and patient, things would improve. But they didn't. He fed on my guilt and my hope, dragging me deeper into a place I had promised myself I would never return to. And the worst part, I knew it was happening, and still I stayed. It all came to a head one night when I couldn't take it anymore. Every conversation with him felt like walking into a storm, and I was exhausted from trying to navigate the chaos. I had avoided confronting him directly for as long as I could, afraid of how he might react. But that night, something inside me snapped. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I told him, point blank, that his behavior was toxic and that I couldn't live like this anymore. At first, he tried to brush it off, laughing like I was making a big deal out of nothing. But when he realized I was serious, his mood shifted. The charm, the calm facade, it all melted away, replaced by anger and accusations. He threw my words back at me, twisting them into something ugly. After everything I've done for you, he spat, you're just going to walk away again? It felt like I was suffocating under the weight of his words, like I was trapped in a room with no air. The argument escalated quickly, spiraling out of control. Every time I tried to explain how I felt, he interrupted, making it about his pain, his struggles. It didn't matter what I said, he only heard what he wanted to hear. His words hit me like punches, each one landing harder than the last. And then, out of nowhere, I felt my chest tighten, my breathing shallow and fast. My hands started shaking, and the room around me began to spin. I didn't understand what was happening at first. All I knew was that I needed to get out, but I couldn't move. It was a panic attack, my first in years. I sat there, frozen, as the tears poured down my face, my body refusing to cooperate. I tried to speak, to tell him I needed a moment to breathe, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just sat there, gasping for air, while he kept talking, oblivious to the fact that I was falling apart right in front of him. Eventually, I managed to hang up the call, my hands fumbling to disconnect before he could say anything else. I collapsed onto the floor, struggling to steady my breath. It felt like I was drowning on dry land. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but all I could feel was the overwhelming weight of everything I had held inside for so long. I realized in that moment that I couldn't do this anymore. No matter how much I wanted to help him, no matter how deeply I felt for him, I couldn't keep sacrificing myself in the process. Something had to change. And for the first time in a long time, I knew that the only way to survive was to walk away for good this time. In the days following that panic attack, I knew something had shifted inside me. There was no going back this time. I felt numb, emotionally drained, but also strangely clear-headed. I didn't want to live in fear anymore, constantly waiting for the next blow to land, whether it was physical or emotional. I made up my mind this was it. I had to cut him off completely, no matter how hard it was or how lonely I felt afterward. There was no space left in my life for him. When I told him we couldn't talk anymore, I expected him to lash out, but instead, he gave me silence. It was eerie, like the calm before a storm. I knew better than to trust it. He had a way of staying quiet just long enough to make me doubt my decision, to make me wonder if I had overreacted. But I had learned from every previous mistake. This time, I didn't wait around for him to change. I blocked his number, cut him off from my social media, and told myself I would never look back. Even with him gone, though, his presence lingered like a shadow. It took time more than I expected for me to feel normal again. Some nights, I'd lie awake, my mind replaying every argument, every insult, every moment I had spent trying to make things work. It felt like trying to unwind a knot that had been tightening for months. But slowly, I started to feel lighter. Each day without him was a small victory, a step toward reclaiming my life. The hardest part was coming to terms with how much I had lost my sense of self, my peace, even my trust in others. I kept replaying moments from our relationship, trying to make sense of how I had let it get so far. The truth was, I didn't even recognize the person I had become by the end of it. But realizing that was also freeing. It meant that I had a chance to rebuild, to start over and leave the chaos behind for good. It wasn't easy, and I stumbled along the way. There were moments when the loneliness felt unbearable, and I questioned whether I had made the right choice. But every time those thoughts crept in, I reminded myself of how far I had come. I didn't escape just to fall back into the same trap. This time, I was going to stay free, no matter how difficult the journey ahead seemed. And in the end, it wasn't just about escaping him, it was about finding myself again. I didn't want to live under the weight of fear and regret anymore. I wanted to breathe, to feel peace, to trust in the future. Walking away was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the only way I could finally begin to heal. Looking back now, I see things much more clearly. The relationship had consumed me, breaking me down piece by piece until I could hardly recognize myself. But with every step I took away from it, I began to rebuild what I had lost. It was slow, painful work learning to trust my instincts again, finding joy in the little things, and forgiving myself for not seeing the signs sooner. For a long time, I carried guilt for everything that had happened. I blamed myself for not leaving sooner, for thinking I could fix someone who didn't want to be saved. But I've come to understand that walking away was not only the right thing to do, it was necessary. Staying would have meant losing myself completely, and I deserved better than that. I deserved to live. The experience changed me in ways I hadn't expected. It forced me to confront my own patterns, like why I felt responsible for someone else's happiness, or why I ignored the red flags when they were so obvious. It wasn't just about him, it was about me too. I had to face the parts of myself that had allowed the situation to go as far as it did. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Over time, I've learned that healing isn't a straight path. Some days, the memories still sneak up on me like shadows from a past life. But now, they no longer hold the same power over me. I can see them for what they are, reminders of a time I survived, not something I'm trapped in anymore. Every scar, every painful memory is proof that I made it through. I don't regret sharing my story. For too long, I stayed quiet, pretending that everything was fine, hoping that ignoring it would make the pain disappear. But telling the truth, even just to myself, was the first real step toward freedom. I needed to acknowledge the damage, to understand how it shaped me, so I could finally begin to let it go. This chapter of my life is closed now. I'm not the same person I was when it began, and I never will be again. But that's okay. Growth means change, even when it hurts. I've learned how to set boundaries, how to say no without guilt, and how to recognize when someone's love is more about control than care. Most importantly, I've learned that I don't need to carry anyone else's pain to prove my worth. In the end, I made it through the darkness, and that's what matters. I'm still here. I'm still standing. And for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of what comes next. It all started with a night that felt like pure fun, the kind you don't think twice about. I was out at a bar, surrounded by strangers, just looking to unwind. That's when I met him. He was charming in a casual, easy way, someone who could make you laugh without trying too hard. We hit it off right away, drinking, dancing, and sharing stories like we had known each other forever. The night blurred by in a haze of music, laughter, and drinks, and before I knew it, we were back at my apartment. It felt natural, not like some spur-of-the-moment fling, but as if we had always been meant to end up there. He told me he was staying at a hostel nearby, but after that night, it was like he never left. I didn't mind. In fact, I enjoyed the company. There was something comfortable about having him around, like filling a space I didn't even realize had been empty. It didn't feel rushed or forced, just easy, like pieces falling into place without much effort. That first night seemed like the start of something exciting, the kind of connection that makes life feel a little less lonely. But what I didn't know then was that I had opened a door that would be almost impossible to close. And once that door opened, the real nightmare began to take shape slowly, quietly, waiting just beneath the surface. There was an energy about him that made it hard not to get swept up. He wasn't like the people I usually met. He had this way of making everything feel spontaneous, like every moment with him was an adventure waiting to happen. After a few hours together, it already felt like I had known him for much longer. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just a sense of ease that was both thrilling and comforting. When the night ended, I figured that would be it, just one of those fleeting encounters you look back on fondly. But he didn't seem in any rush to leave, and, to be honest, I didn't mind. His presence filled the quiet spaces in my life without feeling intrusive. He fit into my routine so seamlessly that it didn't occur to me how strange it was for someone I had just met to stick around like that. It wasn't just that he stayed, it was how quickly he became part of my everyday life. Before I knew it, he wasn't just crashing at my place now and then, he was there all the time. Little things shifted. His clothes ended up in my closet. He helped himself to food from my fridge. It felt like we had skipped the early stages of getting to know each other and jumped straight into something more serious. At first, I thought it was nice having someone around, someone who could turn an ordinary evening into something fun, someone who made me feel like I wasn't alone. But there was a nagging thought in the back of my mind, a question I kept pushing away. Why did it all feel so fast? Why was I so comfortable letting someone I barely knew into my space so quickly? I told myself it was just part of the excitement, part of the thrill of meeting someone new. But part of me knew better. I just didn't want to listen. Not yet. The days with him started blending together, one after another, like a dream you didn't want to wake from until it wasn't. What started as fun began to feel like a routine that moved too fast, but I ignored the unease creeping in. He stayed, and I let him, thinking it was harmless. What could go wrong? He hadn't shown any signs that should have worried me, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. It wasn't just that he was always around, it was how quickly we slipped into something that felt too close, too intimate. We weren't just hanging out anymore, we were sharing our days, our meals, and almost every moment in between. He had become part of my world so effortlessly that I didn't realize how tightly he had woven himself into my life. Looking back, it's strange how easily I let it all happen. 3 months in, we were functioning like we had been together for years. He made himself at home, no questions asked, no discussion about boundaries. His presence grew heavier by the day, slowly overtaking everything. And I let it, because at first, it was easier to go along with it than to confront how uncomfortable it was making me. Sometimes, I wondered about his life before we met. Where were his friends? Why didn't he ever mention family or anyone close to him? But every time I thought about asking, I hesitated. It felt like opening that door would make everything more complicated. So I stayed quiet, convincing myself that what we had was normal. But deep down, I could feel something shifting beneath the surface, like a current pulling me into deeper waters. I tried not to think too much about it. After all, what was the harm in having someone who seemed to care about me? It didn't feel dangerous, yet just a little too intense, a little too fast. And as long as things stayed that way, I told myself, there was no reason to worry. But I was wrong. It happened on what should have been one of the happiest nights of my life, my 30th birthday. We spent the whole evening celebrating, laughing, and drinking until the early hours. Everything felt perfect, or at least I thought it did. I was exhausted by the time we got home, and I fell into bed, completely unaware of the storm that was brewing beneath the surface. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a pain that was sharp and immediate. At first, I couldn't tell what was happening. It was like being pulled from a dream straight into a nightmare. My head throbbed, and as I tried to move, I realized my arms were pinned to my sides. He was sitting on top of me, his legs pressing down on my arms, holding me in place. Before I could even process what was happening, his hands were wrapped around my neck. The air disappeared from my lungs as his grip tightened, and the world around me started to dim. I tried to push him off, tried to scream, but nothing worked. My mind was racing, searching for answers. Was this a dream? A mistake? But it wasn't. This was real. Then, as suddenly as it started, he stopped. Without saying a word, he stood up and walked to the bathroom, leaving me gasping for air. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline making everything feel sharp and surreal. I knew I had to get out. There was no time to think, no time to ask questions. I grabbed my dogs, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto them, and ran to my car. The night air hit me like a slap in the face, cold and unforgiving. I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and sat there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Could it have been an accident? A side effect of his PTSD? I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that because the truth was too terrifying to face. The next morning, my phone buzzed with his name flashing across the screen. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button, torn between fear and confusion. Finally, I answered. His voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm, as if nothing had happened the night before. "Where did you go?" he asked, sounding genuinely puzzled. I told him everything, every blow, every moment I couldn't breathe, and how I had escaped with my dogs in the dead of night. For a moment, there was silence, like he was processing it for the first time himself. Then came the apology. He said he didn't remember any of it, blamed it on his PTSD and night terrors. "I swear, I didn't mean to hurt you," he whispered, his voice trembling. He promised to get help, to make things right, and begged me not to give up on him. It was the kind of apology that felt genuine, full of regret and desperation. And, for a brief moment, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the person I had met, the person I thought I knew, was still in there somewhere. He swore it would never happen again. He asked for just one more chance, promising that if he ever scared me like that again, he'd walk away without question. His words were soothing, a balm over the fear that had been gnawing at me since the night before. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Maybe it really was just a mistake, I told myself. Maybe he just needed someone to believe in him. For a little while, things seemed to settle. He was on his best behavior, careful with his words and actions, trying hard to show me that he was changing. It felt almost normal again, like maybe we could move past what had happened. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. There was a tension beneath the surface, a heaviness in the air that wouldn't go away, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. I thought giving him that second chance would make things better. I thought it would ease the fear I carried. But instead, it only gave me more to lose. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that if it happened again, there would be no more promises left to keep. Exactly 1 week after his first outburst, everything unraveled again, but this time it was worse. I had gone to bed hoping things would stay calm, hoping the promises he made would hold. But in the early hours of the morning, I awoke to a strange pressure on the mattress, the kind that told me I wasn't alone. When my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw him sitting on top of me. He wasn't doing anything, just watching me with a cold, unsettling stillness. My heart raced, every muscle in my body tense as I tried to figure out what was happening. I moved slowly, pretending like I was getting ready to leave for work, trying not to panic. But before I could say a word, he exploded. Out of nowhere, he swung at me a hard punch straight to my mouth. The force of it knocked me back onto the bed, leaving me stunned. Before I could react, his hands were around my neck again, squeezing with the same terrifying strength as before. This time, I didn't fight. I let my body go limp, pretending to pass out, hoping it would make him stop. And it did. His grip loosened, and he stood up, thinking I was unconscious. I waited, barely breathing, as he walked toward the kitchen, leaving me lying there in the dark. As soon as I heard his footsteps fade, I grabbed my dogs and bolted barefoot, disoriented and desperate to get away. I threw myself into the car, slamming the doors shut and locking them as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. Then, through the window, I saw him standing in the doorway, looking directly at me. His expression was calm, too calm, like what had just happened didn't mean anything at all. And that's when I knew the truth. This wasn't some accident. It wasn't a side effect of trauma or nightmares. He knew exactly what he was doing. Suddenly, he sprinted toward the car, banging on the windows, screaming threats that chilled me to the bone. "Come out, or I'll burn your house down," he yelled, his fist slamming against the glass. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled with my phone, praying the police would answer before he found a way in. I knew then that this wasn't going to end peacefully. The seconds felt like hours as I sat in the car, gripping my phone with trembling hands. He kept pounding on the windows, shouting, his words turning more desperate and unhinged with every passing moment. I stayed still, heart racing, praying the glass would hold. His threats grew louder, promises to set everything I owned on fire, to break in and make me regret ever trying to leave. Every slam of his fists made me feel like the walls were closing in. Just as I thought he might actually shatter the window, I heard sirens in the distance. The sound cut through the night, sharp and unmistakable. His demeanor shifted instantly. He stopped banging, straightened his posture, and casually walked back toward the house as if nothing had happened. It was chilling how quickly he could switch from violent rage to eerie calm, like flipping a switch. It was the kind of control that made me realize he knew exactly what he was doing all along. When the police arrived, I frantically explained everything: how he attacked me, threatened me, and chased me to my car. I warned them to be careful, expecting him to resist. But when the officers entered the house, they found him waiting quietly, hands at his sides, smiling like he was greeting old friends. He didn't struggle, didn't argue, just let them cuff him and lead him out without so much as a word. It wasn't relief I felt as they took him away, it was something darker, something colder. It was the sickening realization that he had planned every step, right down to his surrender. He knew how to play the system, how to manipulate every situation to his advantage. And somehow, even in cuffs, he seemed to hold all the power. As they drove off, I sat in my car, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. But I knew it wasn't over. Not really. It wasn't until the investigation that I learned the full extent of what he had planned. When the officers searched the house, they found a butcher's knife on the bed, the same bed where he had attacked me. My stomach twisted at the thought. He hadn't just tried to scare me, he had meant to do something far worse. And the only reason I was still alive was that I had escaped before he had the chance. Even in custody, he stayed one step ahead. At the trial, legal loopholes worked in his favor, and instead of facing charges, he was handed over to immigration authorities. Watching him get taken into ICE custody was the only small victory I had, seeing him taken away, knowing he'd be deported and banned from returning. But even that didn't feel like enough. As the trial unfolded, I thought I'd finally get some closure, but instead, it only left me with more questions. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to every detail being dissected, I felt the weight of everything I had gone through all over again. What disturbed me most wasn't just what he had done, it was how calm he remained through it all, as if none of it mattered. He never once apologized, never showed an ounce of remorse. It was like he was watching a play, completely detached from the harm he had caused. During the investigation, the knife they found on the bed haunted me. I kept replaying that night in my mind, thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't run when I did. The officers couldn't prove his intentions, but I didn't need proof. I knew exactly what that knife meant. The thought of how close I had come to not making it out of that house alive was something I couldn't shake. It lingered, heavy and suffocating. But instead of facing justice for what he did, he managed to slip through the cracks. The district attorney found a loophole, something in the system that allowed them to transfer him to immigration authorities instead of pursuing criminal charges. It was a crushing moment watching him avoid accountability. But seeing ICE agents waiting for him the moment he left the courthouse brought a small flicker of satisfaction. They took him away in silence, just as calmly as he had lived through every other moment of this nightmare. I knew he would be deported, banned from returning to the country, but even that didn't feel like enough. There were no guarantees that the danger he posed would disappear with him. I had escaped, but that didn't mean I felt safe. And as if to prove that point, the messages started not long after he was gone. Fake social media accounts, each one carrying the same desperate plea. Help me appeal. I need to come back. Block after block, he found ways to reach me, like he couldn't bear the thought of letting me go. The distance between us gave me some peace, but not the kind of peace I had hoped for. The trial might have ended, but my fear hadn't. Every message reminded me that he was still out there, waiting, watching, hoping to find a way back into my life. Even though he was gone, the fear stayed with me like a shadow that refused to lift. I wanted to believe that with him deported, I could finally move on. But healing isn't that simple. Every night, I lay awake, haunted by the memories of what happened. Sleep became a battle I rarely won. Even when I closed my eyes, I felt like he was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting to strike again. I tried to convince myself I was safe, that the thousands of miles between us would be enough to keep him away. But the fear didn't listen to reason. Every time my phone buzzed with a new message, my heart would skip a beat. It didn't matter if it was a friend or a harmless notification, my mind always went to the worst place. What if it was him again, with another fake account, trying to worm his way back into my life? What if one day he found a way to return? I thought about blocking out the world completely, disappearing from social media, but that felt like letting him win. So instead, I left the accounts up but rarely checked them, avoiding the reminders that he was still trying to get through to me. It was exhausting, carrying that fear with me everywhere I went, but I couldn't seem to put it down. Some nights, I'd lie awake thinking about the knife they found on the bed, wondering just how close I had come to dying that night. It was a terrifying thought, knowing that someone who had smiled at me, laughed with me, and stayed in my home had also planned something so dark. No matter how much distance I tried to put between myself and those memories, they clung to me, always just beneath the surface. Eventually, I realized I couldn't do it alone. The weight of it all, the fear, the anger, the sleepless nights was too much to carry. I needed help. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider therapy, to admit that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Sharing my story was the first step, but I knew there was more work to be done. I wish I could say that everything got better right away, but healing is a slow process. Some days are easier than others, and I hold on to those moments tightly. I've learned that it's okay to take things one day at a time, to be gentle with myself as I rebuild. I might never completely shake the fear, but I'm learning how to live with it, and that's enough for now. This chapter of my life is over, but the scars it left behind will stay with me, and that's okay. Scars mean survival. They mean I made it through. And now, every step I take is one more step away from the darkness he tried to pull me into. One day, I hope I'll stop looking over my shoulder. But until then, I'll keep moving forward because surviving is just the beginning.